Hi, I'm Pastor Scott Frederickson of First Lutheran Church in Blair, Nebraska. And we invite you to our ongoing Bible study and reader's introduction to the Gospel of Mark. In this session, we'll be talking about Mark chapter 8. And so I invite you to grab your Bible and open up to that chapter. We'll begin with the first verse. And we'll look through, this is a pivotal chapter as we go into the story. I mean, if you think about the Gospel of Mark in general, there is, 16 chapters, right? But the last chapter is really only 8 verses, and it's kind of an ambiguous one, and we're going to talk about that when we get to that in a few weeks. But so if you think about it, I mean, we're halfway through the book, and if you read stories, if you think about a story, any story, whether you watch it a book or a movie or whatever the case may be, about halfway in, you expect to kind of say, okay, now something's got to change. We know who all the characters are. We know the players and the team. We got a sense of what's going on and who's doing what. And so now all of a sudden it's going to get important here. And so we need to have a shift. And the Gospel of Mark is no different than that. In fact, Mark is a great little literary exercise in this, and I always had fun. I remember years ago when I was learning Greek and taking Greek to just kind of revel in just kind of the sheer beauty of the Gospel of Mark and how so many of the literary conventions that we use in our lives are exemplified in this briefest of Gospels. So let's take a look at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verse 1. Now in those days, when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd, because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. His disciples replied, well, how can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? And he asked them, well, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute. And they distributed them to the crowd. They had also a few small fish, and after blessing them, he ordered that these too should be distributed. They ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now there was about 4,000 people, and he sent them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking for a sign from heaven to test him, and he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, Watch out, beware the yeast of the Pharisees, the yeast of Herod. And they said to one another, Is it because we have no bread? And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I took the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. And then he said to them, Do you not yet understand? All right. So the chapter opens up with another feeding story. And interestingly enough, a lot of folks think that what Mark did was there was only one feeding event back in Jesus' time, and Mark just kind of had 2 versions of it, and so he just kind of put it together. And that might possibly be true, but Mark uses the second feeding event differently than he uses the first feeding event. If you go back to look at where Jesus fed the 5,000, right? That what he was looking at there was he was telling the disciples that as they were coming back from this great commission that they'd been given to preach the gospel, that they had the capacity to be able to feed this crowd. And they didn't think they did. They didn't trust themselves that they had that capacity to feed so many people with so few fish and so few loaves of bread. But this story is slightly different. Because in this particular story, Jesus doesn't challenge the disciples to go feed him. He takes it all upon himself. He says that he has great compassion for the crowd, just as he did before. But this time, he's worried that if he sends them away, they're not going to be well, that they're not going to be healed. And he doesn't have any real concern about whether the disciples are able to feed them or not. What he's worried about is he's worried about the care of the people. And it's the care of the people that are listening to him that he takes what bread and fish he has and feeds the people. So it's not about trying to discover in the second feeding about whether the disciples have the capacity to trust the commission that they've been given from Jesus. But rather in the second feeding, it's another story of Jesus' just great love for what he has with people. And so then immediately juxtaposed with Jesus again feeding an incredible amount of people with a little amount of food, the Pharisees are starting to argue with him. And there's this wonderful line in verse 12. He sighed deeply in his spirit. I mean, we're halfway through the story, like I said, and Jesus is getting tired. He's getting tired of arguing with the Pharisees. He's getting tired of people wondering about these kinds of miracles like feeding the 4,000 people with just so few amounts of fish or bread. He's just getting weary. Maybe you've gotten weary. I think of it, for example, when we first had kids and they were babies, it takes forever to teach a kid how to use a fork. And I remember Chris saying, how come babies can't be born learning how to use a fork? Do you know how many times you have to pick up the food that they throw on the floor, they smash across their faces? And even when they do kind of sort of gather the idea that they're to use a fork, they sort of stab at food and they miss it and it goes all over the place. And sometimes they poke their own hands and it almost becomes a deadly weapon in the hands of a 3-year-old or even a 5-year-old to use a fork. But every time you have to patiently show them how to use it. You have to patiently clean up the mess. You have to patiently work with these young people so that eventually they learn how to use a fork and can participate in civilized dinners, like what we talk about at Worship Lab. But it isn't something that we know innately. It's something that requires constant attention and constant work by parents, grandparents, anybody, daycare providers, preschool teachers, whatever it may be, to teach somebody how to use a fork. And sometimes it can get pretty weary. One more time of cleaning up the food that's on the floor or the food that hasn't been eaten, or they're shoving the food in their face with their hands, which is so non-Western. Gets weary. And Jesus is in that same kind of boat. He's getting weary of teaching us how to eat with a fork. We just keep throwing the food all over the place. We just keep stuffing it into our faces and not even trying to pretend that we know what's going on. And so Jesus just says, listen, there's not going to be a sign. And so immediately what happens after that, of course, is that then he's back in the boat and he's just weary. And now the disciples once again don't get it. He says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. And the disciples are like, oh man, is he getting on us because we didn't have any bread? It's all about them all of a sudden, right? It's not about, oh gosh, what's Jesus doing? He just fed another group of people. Or even that he said, hey, listen, we're not going to even give you a sign. They're like worried about themselves. They're like, oh man, he used the word yeast and we didn't have any bread. We suffered. And Jesus was like, oh, now I'm sighing too deeply for you guys. No, the yeast that the Pharisees and Herod have, Jesus says, is a danger. And whatever that yeast may be, I'll leave that up to the individual readers. There's lots of options for that. The yeast could be their co-conspiracy with the Roman Empire. The yeast could be their fundamental nature to view the tradition as more important than God, or any of those kinds of issues that Jesus has talked about up to this point. And you can sort of go through and read the first 7 chapters and try to figure out what the yeast is that Jesus is talking about. What is that's going to infect the loaf of bread that Jesus is making? I mean, if you think of Jesus, his ministry is making a loaf of bread, and he thinks that the yeast that the Pharisees or Herod could put into it would infect that loaf of bread, okay? That it would lead them to not the loaf of bread that Jesus wants to make, but it would instead become the loaf of bread that the Pharisees or Herod wants to make. And Jesus warns his disciples not to fall into that trap. So Jesus is talking about something like this, and they're not getting it. They think it's all about themselves. And Jesus is like, no, look, what have I been doing? What the first time I did the feeding? How many people feed? Yeah, for 5,000. How many bread? How much bread? Yeah, 12 loaf baskets. I mean, Jesus is like, what do you think is going on here? I mean, how do we do this? What's this about? It's not about the bread, right? It's about what God does to keep people healthy and safe and whole. God has a preferred future for each and every one of us. God has a preferred future for you. God has a preferred future for me. And Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit is out here in the world to help and to make that future a reality for you. Do you believe that? Well, let's see how the disciples respond. In verse 22. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village, and when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they kind of look like trees walking." And Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." So here's a man that's not part of the village, and when he's at the village, all the people are wanting Jesus to cure this guy. And they don't say why. It's not because they're afraid of this guy, like they were with the Gerasene demoniac, or even that he might be, like an official's daughter, like with Jairus. But they want Jesus to heal him. But instead of healing him right in the village, he takes him out of the village. And that's an interesting way, because when Jesus does heal him, takes a couple times, Jesus apparently didn't have that particular healing down to a science. He doesn't send the guy back into the village to all the people who said, "Heal me." He sends him back to his home, which isn't in this particular village. So there's something going on there in this part of the story. Mark doesn't elaborate on it much, but for Mark's original audience, this man that had been healed was somebody that they all knew, but personally, or maybe they knew the relatives of this person, and so they wanted to include this story. But it's an interesting story, shows a little bit about Jesus, but it still goes to Jesus' identity, because who is Jesus? He's the Christ of God. He's the Messiah, right? And this is just another example of what Jesus can do. He can heal a man with mud, even if it does take a little bit of an adjustment here and there to make it perfect. All right? So we continue on with verse 27. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. And then he began to teach them, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." And he said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." All right, this is it. This is where the story now takes a shift. Because as they just happened to be wandering down the road toward another set of cities, Caesarea Philippi, Jesus just casually asks, as always, making conversation on the trail, on the road. They have conversations, what you do. "Who do people say that I am now?" And some people are saying John the Baptist, Elijah, they're giving all kinds of answers. But Jesus says, "Okay, that's what they say. What do you all say?" And Peter answers, "You are the Messiah." Now, this is the first time in the story that anyone has actually said this, other than some demons. Okay, so this is an interesting point. So Jesus then says, "Oh, whoa! Somebody got the answer right." All right. So now Peter is actually in the same boat that you and I are in. Just as we know who Jesus is, Peter is now on our side as a reader, and as the readers, we're finally like, "This is it. Peter is somebody that we can resonate with." So then Jesus says, "Okay, don't tell anyone about that." And now Peter's like, wait a minute. We finally got it right, and now you don't want us to share the answer. But they got it right. But they got it right with only half the story, right? We've only read up to chapter 8. In fact, Peter gets it right in verse 29. So we still got a few verses left in this particular chapter. Because what Jesus wants us to see is, yes, now you know who I am. But what does the Messiah do? Is the Messiah just about healing people? Is the Messiah just about feeding people? Is the Messiah just about feeling bad for people? Is the Messiah just about curing the sick? And what does the Messiah actually do? And this is the question that Peter has to address. And so Jesus, now that Peter has said the Messiah, that Jesus is the Messiah, now Jesus is like, okay, now you know who I am. Now we're going to talk about what I do. All right? So all these pieces that Jesus has done up to this point, whether it's a miracle or a healing or whatever it is, are going to talk about who Jesus is. And who Jesus is the Messiah. But what does a Messiah do? What does a Messiah do? Let's say, so for example, I'm a preacher, so what do? Well, teach some Bible stuff. I preach sermons. That's what I do. If you're a car salesman, what do? You sell cars. If you're work at a lineman, what do? You fix the lines. If you're a computer programmer, what do? You make computer programs. If you're a banker, what do? You manage bank. I mean, these are all things that you do. Well, what is the job description of a Messiah? That's the question that Mark's going to address now for the rest of his book. Now that we know who Jesus is, we got to figure out what Jesus is going to do. And so Jesus says, here's what a Messiah does. And he just talks about what's going to happen to him. He's going to undergo great suffering, rejected by the elders. He's going to be killed, but after 3 days, he's going to rise again. And he said it all quite openly, Mark said. So this is Jesus saying, oh, finally, you know who I am. Good. You know I'm the Messiah. Good. Now we're going to talk about what I'm going to do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to suffer and I'm going to die, but I'll rise again. Peter is like, whoa, that's not what a Messiah does. Peter has a different idea about what the Messiah does. So he rebukes Jesus and says, you can't say that kind of stuff. That's not what a Messiah does. But notice this interesting little phrase in verse 33, but turning and looking at his disciples. So in other words, Peter comes up to Jesus and says, you can't do this. But Jesus doesn't respond to Peter and say, you can't tell me what to do. He looks at the disciples and he says, get behind me. For you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. In other words, Jesus tells the disciples that Peter, although he got it right about who Jesus is, he doesn't have it yet about what Jesus does as a Messiah. And what Jesus does as a Messiah is different than what Peter is thinking about. Because Peter is thinking about what humans would do with the Messiah. And that's not what Jesus is about. Jesus is about what God does as a Messiah. What does God do as a Messiah? So now, take a look at what has to happen in order for God's definition of a Messiah, for God's job description of a Messiah to be enacted in the human realm. And that's what's interesting about the particular job description of the Messiah, is that it's done not in the realm of heaven, but rather earth. Let's take a look at what Jesus says on verse 34. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in his glory of his Father with the holy angels. And he said to them, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. Now, granted, I finished with the first verse of chapter 9. We'll pick up the next session at verse 2. Sometimes the people who broke up the chapters weren't working on the same kind of paginations that we do in our modern versions of the Bible. But notice what Jesus says about what it means to be the Messiah and what it means to have and follow this particular Messiah. That you're going to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Now, interestingly, you're going to think of a cross, and you're going to think of this cross that just sort of, stands there, and you got to pick that cross up. But for Jesus, the cross is basically life itself. All life is cruciform in this sense. It rolls along on a sort of horizontal plane, and then God breaks in at certain times of your life and forms the cross of your life. And as we find out in this particular story, as we go through the next few chapters, bearing the cross is sort of just putting up with life. It's the suffering that we do when we realize our world is not what we thought it was going to be. I mean, how many people planned on spending the last 3.5 months at shelter in place, or not being able to go to a restaurant or a bar or any of the things that were part of our entertainment, and not being able to see family or friends because we have to stay in our own little socially distant pods. I mean, nobody planned on that. Nobody planned on a police officer in Minnesota putting his knee on a black man and killing him, and that sparking racial protests all across this country. Nobody plans on these things. It's just part of the general way of living. It's part of the life. It's part of the cross that all of us bear. But we pick this cross up now and we follow Jesus. We don't follow Satan. We don't follow our human things, but we follow Jesus, who is divine, who is the Son of God, who is the Messiah. And so when you if you deny yourself, take up the cross and follow me, you are setting your mind on divine things, the divine way of being the Messiah. And it's completely different than what you may have thought a Messiah is going to be if you're thinking about it only in human terms. So Jesus wants us to see that what we are about now is living into the reality of what the Messiah creates for us, what the Messiah does. Chapter 8 is a way in which we transition from who Jesus is to what Jesus does as the Messiah. Who Jesus is as the Messiah to what he does as the Messiah. And it's a wonderful ride for the next 7 chapters as we read about the work of the Messiah, who is Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Let us pray together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. See you next time, and stay in touch.